It is my distinct privilege to introduce the three guys who are going to be part of our plenary discussion panel. Two of these I've known for a long time. The third one I have just gotten to know. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to introduce each one of them. And what we're going to do is have them come up. I'm going to ask them a series of questions. They're going to just begin to talk about their experiences in how faith has entered into what God called them to do. The place God called them to serve Him in the workplace and how their faith has entered into that. First guy I want to bring forward, an old friend, Mark Albers, former Senior Vice President of ExxonMobil Corporation. Mark, would you come forward, please? Second part of our panel, Cedric Burgher, Chief Financial Officer for Occidental Petroleum Corporation. Cedric, would you come on up? Third, one of my new good friends, Tom Elsenbrook, the Managing Director of Albers and Marsal Holdings. Tom, come on up. It's a pretty austere panel, wouldn't you think? There is countless years of business experience globally being represented right here. And I want to start, guys, I'm really just going to throw the softballs at you and let you guys take it and run with it, all right? Because these people are interested to hear what you have to say. So I'm going to ask you a first question. Tom, let me land this in your court. Who's your favorite biblical leader and why?
All right, I actually took notes on this. And there's plenty of them. And I was telling our singers that I didn't want the first question because I wanted to put as much distance between high performance and mediocre performances as possible. But I did sit between them and got advice from them. I put Nehemiah. You could pick anyone, but Nehemiah's great. Example of, he had an opportunity come to him. He had information come to him, so he became aware of a problem. He fasted, he prayed. One of the things that I like best about it is, he asked his boss for permission to go. And one of the most important things I think for all of us is you've got to have the highest standard of work. Think of gold standard work, gives you a passport to go do other things. If he would have been a poor performer, he probably wouldn't have been in that position to have the ability. So the passport to do things is gold standard work. And he made the request to return to Jerusalem. He planned. So opportunities comes to many of us, many people that perform. He planned. He got a fact base. The way we describe it in our firm is we don't value hip shooters. We want you to have a fact base. So he got his letters from the king to grant passage, to get timber and lumber. And when he arrived, he went out by himself and inspected. He got a fact base. So he understood the problem. And then he had a bias for action and he executed. He communicated the vision. He connected the individuals and their part to the big vision so that they were working for the big vision, but they were really working for themselves too. And that was brilliant. He cut taxes. Think of it. Anytime you accumulate, power, centrally, maybe bad things happen. He shared his food. He forgave debt, and he rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside everybody else.
So I think what you're trying to tell us is, if he'd come forward with his resume, you would have hired him.
Yeah, but the real point one of the points I really want to make is, if you're a top performer, whether you're at the early part of your career, the end of your career, opportunities are going to come from you. So you've got to do gold standard work no matter what you're doing, and that's your passport to go within organizations, outside of organizations, to be exposed to opportunities.
Great. Tom, thanks. Cedric.
I agree with Tom. There are a lot of great great choices. There are also a lot of good examples of what not to do, failures. The Bible is, full of those examples. But, I'm going to steal from the song we just sang a little bit. The name is Jesus. And talk about gold standard leadership. And, he kind of turns a lot of our natural thinking upside down, including especially with leadership. He modeled it. He talked about servant leadership. Matthew 20, he talked about the kings and the rulers lorded over you and are tyrants. And how many times do we see that? Who's had a bad boss? But he said, but it's not like that with you. That if you want to lead and be a great leader, you need to be a servant. And then he went on to even suggest that's what he's doing, which of course he did. Yeah. And so, I think Christ has so many great things for us. I love what he said directly. I love all the other things, Paul and others said too. But what Christ said directly, I think, has so much to teach us in leadership in so few words. And his modeling of that, I think, is hard. It's the gold standard.
Yeah. Good. Thanks, Cedric. Mark.
Yeah, so I agree. I think one of the leaders that's meant a lot to me is Joshua. He was a guy that didn't appoint himself as leader. He was called. It wasn't his idea. He was kind of in the shadows for most of his life, and he wasn't self-appointed. He was somebody that was very much acquainted with his weaknesses and his fears, because God had to tell him 3 times, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Why? Because he wasn't strong and he wasn't courageous. He was weak. He had weaknesses and he had fears. And he was in way over his head. He was being asked to do something on a world scale very few people have done, in that span of time. Lead 2 million people across the river. The manna was about to dry up as soon as they crossed the Jordan. He was going to have to get food for these 2 million people. He was going to have to, all the sanitation, all the logistics, and then he was going to have to attack trained forces who had walled fortresses, and he had people whose grandfathers were bricklayers, their fathers were cowards. They'd fought a few battles. He and Caleb had fought battles, so he knew what was needed, but he saw what he had and had some legitimate fears and weaknesses. And that speaks to me because typically as leaders, and you wouldn't be in this room if you weren't being called into leadership or leading, we will focus on our strengths and how we'll use our strengths to our advantage. We'll focus on the weaknesses of our opposition or the market and how we're going to exploit those. And then when it comes to our own weaknesses and fears, we either say, man up, woman up, I can't be afraid, I can't be weak, I'm a leader. So we'll shove those down. And yet Joshua did the opposite. And I would just tell you that if you don't think you have any weaknesses, that is your weakness. So it's really understanding the weaknesses of your strategy, the weaknesses of your position, and being authentic and real with those before God. Maybe it's resources, maybe it's financial resources, maybe it's people, maybe it's, you name it, lack of support, maybe it's opposition. And then the fears, the fears dealing with the unknowns. What are you really afraid of? And being honest about that. And again, if you're not afraid of anything as a leader, you probably don't know the unknowns that you're dealing with. Because every leader, every venture has weaknesses in strategy, resources, time, materials, and it has things that are unknown that you have zero control over. And so when you deal with those two things and you're in way over your head, he was a guy that had no choice but to trust the Lord.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Let me bring, because you kind of opened the door for this question. What would you consider one essential characteristic that every leader has to have? Characteristic. Yeah. One essential characteristic.
Well, I think it's once you understand your weaknesses and your fears and you're transparent, even if it means writing them down, and for guys, oftentimes we have to do this, it's then having the courage to do something about it, other than, shove it down and bury it and hope it goes away. And hope is never a good plan when it comes to dealing with our weaknesses and our fears. So I think it's that courage to do something about it. Oftentimes, in a work environment, you get 10 people around a table, and people will look for the person that's maybe the most talkative, or the one that works the longest hours, or the one that's most charismatic, or the one that is most funny, as kind of the natural leader, or the one who appoints themselves as the leader. We've all dealt with people like that, like, I'm your leader, I will take you where you don't want to go. But the leader is never one of those 10. It's typically the person that sees the same thing everybody else sees, but there's one difference, and that is they have the courage to do something about it. And another fellow that had the courage to do something about it was David. He wasn't even supposed to be on the battlefield that day. He was the skinniest, the lightest, the youngest, the most inexperienced. Been watching sheep his whole life. His brothers were of a fighting age. And they all knew what to do. Somebody had to go take on Goliath. It was apparent to everybody. But he had the courage to do something about it, to trust the Lord with it. And he developed that courage with small challenges that came his way, with the lions and the bears that came along while he was bored watching sheep and playing the harp. So that's would be my encouragement to you, is develop that courage in you now with the known challenges you have in front of you. Maybe it's in a family, maybe it's in your team, maybe there's somebody that's a real problem in the team, and everybody's kind of walking around, tiptoeing around how to deal with Joe or Mary or Sue. But it's having the courage, even if you're not appointed or the named leader or have a title, to have the courage to go in and do something about that, pray about it, and address that issue, whether it's a family member or a team member, or it's sort of like the big elephant in the room. Everybody knows it's there, but people are kind of dancing around it. So I think courage is important, but not waiting until Goliath shows up to develop it. Develop it now. God's bringing the lions and the bears and the small things now, because he wants to train you in developing that courage muscle. And courage is just a choice. Fear is a normal, healthy emotion. It saves our lives many times. You can't control fear. It comes on you, but then you have a choice in how you're going to respond to it.
Thanks, Mark. Cedric, one essential characteristic that every leader must have.
There are obviously a lot to choose from. Lots of fruits of the Spirit and things like that. But, I would go with humility because, again, Christ talking about servant leadership, it's not natural, especially when you're elevated, to be humble. And our sin nature, and we're prone to wander. So, but Christ, I love how he paints the word picture in John 15, where he talks about the vine and the branches, and make no mistake, we're the branches, dependent on the vine. And he goes on to say, apart from me, you can do nothing. Yeah. And so if you understand the reality of life, not what we see and touch, the physical, temporal side, but the eternal side, the spiritual realm, which is the greater reality, if you understand that, you understand you can really do nothing apart from Christ. Nothing of value for sure. And as a leader, you certainly are not going to be a great leader in the right sense if you aren't a servant. It makes that clear. So I think humility is critical. I think it's understanding who you are and your dependency. Mark, you said it well. We are dependent on our Maker for any good thing that we could do, including leading well. And so doing that humbly. I will say, of course, we've been around lots of leaders in our lives, and a lot of people are thrown in a leadership position. It doesn't make them a great leader. They just happen to have the position for a time. We're all renting things. We're renting our position, our places we live. Everything in this life is rented in that mindset. But just because you're thrust in a leadership position doesn't mean you're going to do well with it. The stewardship thing, you may actually be a terrible leader, and what a bummer that is. So I think coming to serve and having a humble mindset is critical.
Good. Tom?
Yeah, I'm going to add on to, I've got three things. One is I'm going to add on to Cedric's comment about Jesus turning things upside down. Yeah, and the words I use on that is, if conventional wisdom is wrong and you're right, that's a big opportunity. And that comes out, Tim Dunn brought that to me. He's one of the supporters of this organization and one of the most successful oil and gas guys in the Permian Basin. I took 20 of our oil and gas young people out, and he said, make them all read Moneyball by Michael Lewis before they show up. And he wanted them to know about conventional wisdom, when it's wrong and you've got insight into something different. It creates great opportunities. I've got two things on the characteristic. I would say one of them, if you don't have clarity of purpose, then you're not going to know where to spend your time, where to invest in capabilities to build. So if you don't have a description of why you walk on this world, then it's hard to make choices between investment in your time. Some of the headlines out of my personal purpose is I invest in high potential young leaders that are in impactful organizations. And I help them learn the challenges of high aspirations and both the failing and the joy of that, and do it with courage, humility. And that's kind of one of the reasons I'm on this earth, and it allows me to make choices of where I spend my time and who I invest in and what I do. Conventional wisdom sometimes in my mind can be, well, we invest in the lost, and maybe underinvest in the saved. And I challenge all of us, in the that are believers, to invest in each other and improve, their capabilities. As far as simply on characteristics, go to emotional intelligence. Everybody this is what I tell everybody in my firm. Everybody in my firm has enough IQ to be successful, but it's the emotional intelligence that's going to cause them to win or lose or rise. And emotional intelligence is 5 things. It's self-awareness, which we talked about. It's understanding strengths, weaknesses, and it's self-regulation. Knowing how to regulate your behavior based on your self-awareness. It's motivation, which if you're in this room today, you don't have a problem with motivation. It's empathy. It looks like we're males in this room will probably have problems with empathy. That is a key skill to be, and characteristic to be successful, and it's social skills. So, and if you want to know where to find that, go to Daniel Goleman's Emotional Intelligence. And you can even, there's a 1997 article in Harvard Business Review that is 10 pages. Send me an email if you can't find it, and I'll send it to you.
Good. I really appreciate you guys. What you're not giving us is the intellectual answers. You're giving us the personal answers, and I'm really grateful for that.
Maybe a function of IQ. At least on this side of the panel.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna throw a question at you, and I have to be honest, this is a question that Tom, when we were talking earlier, you said this would really be an interesting question to ask. So I'm gonna place it, Tom, I'm gonna place it at you first. What's one question that you would have liked to have asked the influential leaders in your own life?
Oh, did I get that question?
Because word for word, I wrote that one down, brother.
You sent it on the email, and this is how I. One of the things if I was in your job, I would try to get us to expose our thinking as clearly as possible, and I do that when I'm leading panel discussions, and when I'm seeking guidance, I try to expose my thinking as clearly as possible so that people that I respect and want their input can see it. And I'll use an example. You guys probably know Joe Foster from one of the most influential oil and gas guys in town. He was in his 70s when he was helping me, and we had just started this business, and I'd bring him my quarterly business report. I brought him my plan. I would share the strengths and weaknesses, and this 70-year-old guy and I was young back then, he had way more energy, and he was way smarter than me, and he would just, it'd be like a coach. He'd tell you the good things, the bad things. But by opening up and sharing everything and not just saying, well, Joe, I'm 6'4", I'm handsome and witty, and then showing up and he said, well, you don't really look 6'4", handsome or witty. showing them the whole thing. Expose your thinking to those that you respect and with different perspectives so that they can offer you the feedback. And that's his coaching was some of the best coaching I ever had. But that's what I thought of when I saw the question that I put in there that I forgot I put in there.
Yeah. So, Cedric, let me move this one down to you because I'm going to come back to Tom in just a minute. What's one question? Think about the influential leaders in your life. What's the one question that you would like to have asked that you never did?
I love thinking about how many ways the Lord's blessed me. One of which is just being around a lot of great leaders, especially the godly ones. I don't know if Dave Anderson's here, but he's definitely on that list. I had a really good time here, especially in the 90s. If you think about the greatest commandments, love God and love others, I would want to ask the great leaders, how have you done that, and how does it manifest itself, loving God and loving others in the midst of what your calling is, your leadership position?
Great question. Mark?
Yeah, I think the question I would ask is one that I didn't think of asking, but somebody actually told me about 10 or 11 years ago, and it's kind of, I don't know if you remember the movie City Slickers, and Curly's there, and he's telling Billy Joel or whatever, you got to find that one thing. And the question would be, what is the one thing that you would focus on in your career and as a leader? But this gentleman shared it with me about 10 or 11 years ago, and I wish I had not spent the prior 20 years without it. And it was that I went into work thinking, your business is your business, my business is my business, my job is my job, my ministry is my ministry. And so I would think of what I should do, make up my plans, that I'd bring them to God eventually. And the more and more I got over my head as went in different positions, asking God to bless those and move things that I couldn't move. And it wasn't until about 12 years ago this gentleman said, you got it all wrong. Your business is not, your ministry is not your ministry. It's God's. He is at work in your business. Your business would exist unless you're in some unlawful enterprise. Your business would exist if there'd never been a fall, because God is providing for his creation that he made, whether it's energy, it's food, whether it's clothes, whether it's finances, what have you. And it's God's business. He invented it. He knows how it works. He knows where the oil and gas is. He knows how to find it. He knows the technology. So you need to get involved in what he's doing in your business. And yes, God is very active in oil and gas and in finance. And he's keenly interested in it. He made it. He created it. He delights in watching us, understand what he set in motion. So getting our heads around, this is God's business. This industry I'm in, no business exists unless it serves a purpose of society, right? So as soon as what you're making is not of interest to society, you're done. And that's not a coincidence. That's because that's what God is doing. He's causing it to rain on the just and the unjust, and the sun to shine on the just and unjust, out of grace and love until he comes back. And so getting our heads around, I'm doing something that has not only meeting a need of society, and it's good, no matter what they tell me or my neighbors, but it's God's business, and he's intensely interested in it. And even the grind and the details and the bureaucracy. And he's waiting for me to come to him. It's his garden. He's in the garden, Adam and Eve, working. He's waiting for me to come to him and say, Father, there's a boulder here I cannot move out of the way. Instead, he watches me for 20 years trying to push it, whatever, spray water on it, do all these different things. And he's waiting for you and I to come and say, Father, help me garden this garden. It's your garden. It's your idea. It's your business. What do you want me to focus on here? And when we get in touch with what he's doing, and we're not trying to get him to bless what we think needs to be done, it changes the dynamic and brings a totally different result and perspective. And it gives you divine purpose in your work as a ministry, because it is. It's the way he made it.
So would that be, what it sounds to me like what you just described is that was kind of your shift to, this is actually what God has called me to do. He's called me to do his work here. I'm now serving him here. Cedric, was there that kind of an aha moment for you, a moment in which you went, oh, this changed completely how I view my work? Was there that kind of a shift in your thinking?
I mean, I don't have a burning bush moment, but I will say, over the years, my thinking has definitely changed or evolved. I came to Christ at a young age and had several opportunities in my youth to grow closer to him and learn of him, and went to college thinking I was going to go into the ministry and go to seminary, and that was kind of my college plan for a period of time. And then I had just had this kind of dread, but I'm not a preacher. I can't do that. And so I ended up not doing that and going into business, getting a business degree in banking and so on. And but I always knew that Christ had a plan, for me. I just, didn't know what it was. And I remember I used to spend a lot of time and even read books on, how to discern God's will how to discern God's will. What is God's will? Do I put a fleece down? Those kind of things. How do I do that? And I think that's important because we want to abide in him and we want to be a part of his will. There should be actually no greater thing that we should be challenged to do is to be in his will constantly. And so, but what I realize, it's bigger than work. It's my entire life. It's everything, but it absolutely includes work. Every moment at work, and you need to have the mindset that Jesus is right there, because he is. And everything you say, you're accountable. And there are times that he may call you to get fired. Now, that's an extreme example, but there are times he's going to call you to stand up with integrity in a situation. It doesn't happen that often, and it may never happen. I hope it doesn't for you, but there are times when it does, and by God's grace, we'll pass a few of the tests. We're going to fail a lot too, and when it does, we come back to the cross. And but I guess over time, I've just seen really more and more how everything is God's, and that absolutely includes our work life.
Well, it seems to me you've just described the gold standard that Tom was talking about. So, Tom, you've had this 70-year-old mentor, you've laid it in front of him. Was there a specific lesson that stuck, that he landed in your lap and said, take this away? This is the takeaway for you.
All right. Well, I'm in professional services, so I have the opportunity to work with a large number of people much younger than me with higher IQs. And so I'm meeting with Joe Foster. I'm going through my plan, and this is an oil and gas guy. What does he know about professional services? And we had just started this firm. We started in 2004. And he said, Tom, you're really not going to have a true, it's Alvarez and Marcel is the name of the firm. We call it A&M, not Texas A&M, but people from Texas A&M. But he said, Tom, you're not going to have a true A&Mer until you get somebody off campus and promote them to managing director or partner, which is kind of the ownership level. And so this year we promoted, and he started with us as an intern in 2004, and he was promoted to partner. And the point is that, so I walked out of that meeting. I said, he's an oil and gas guy. He doesn't know anything about professional services. And I started thinking about it. And then I put it into my planning and my personal mission statement is, to complete my vision here, I've got to have a number of people that we've had from, off campus into the partnership and be trained in all the things that we believe to help companies and help people. And then I've got true A&Mers that are going to be leading the firm. So that changed my thinking a lot. The whole point of it, though, is to take this group of people that you think can add a lot of value to you, both personally and in business or collectively, and share what you're thinking and do it in an objective way so that they can see it. You know Tim Dunn, don't you? Mm-hmm. He's one of the smartest guys, best critical thinkers. I've got a 3-page synopsis of what I'm going to do between the ages, what I kind of is in my mind between the ages of 60 and 70. And I sent it to him, and he's not necessarily a nice guy, I just kind of held my breath and pushed send and asked him to look at it, and he's going to look at it and he's going to give me objective, critical feedback, and it makes you, it makes you feel small and weak when you've worked on something, but it made it better, and he challenged my thinking.
Which actually is him being nice, but
it doesn't feel good. But that's the point. You got to get out of your comfort zone. You got to share what's in your mind with the people that can help you. If you just keep it all to yourself, you're going to get smaller thinking, and you're not going to have the accountability, and you're not going to be able to, think bigger or, turn things up, turn things down. That's one of the things what do you want me to turn up? What do you want me to turn down? And get that feedback so that you can make mid-course adjustments.
Yeah. So let me shift us just for a moment. I really want to begin to have some discussion about even deeper where, for you personally, where faith and work collide. We can see biblical examples all over the place of how men of God, in the things that they were called to, turned to prayer. I know you guys wouldn't be sitting up here if prayer wasn't important, but I want to ask you, how did prayer impact your leadership? You as leaders, at the level that you've been leadership at, how did prayer impact your leadership? Mark?
Yeah, well, it was sort of to your point, Marcus, it was sort of the natural next step. Once I got my head around, this is God's business, it's not mine, and what is he doing here, and he's intensely interested in it, and understood kind of what my weaknesses were. And again, if you don't have any, that is your weakness, and and voice kind of the things that of the unknowns that I had no control over and that I was afraid of then, and I realized how far over my head I was in the role, particularly in our case, from an energy standpoint. At the time, about 80% of our production came from outside of the U.S. So in most other countries, you've got to go in and meet heads of state and energy ministers and ask for permission and make your case on why they should let you come in and explore in their country. And so, we had situations where, I guess what I'd call, we came up against immovable obstacles, those big stones in the garden that I felt like the Lord was just saying, ask me to help move this, because you have no freaking way or influence to do it. and that was a pretty short conversation, because it was very, very apparent. We had situations where over time, as I began praying about these immovable obstacles in my business, of getting into certain countries or getting through certain projects, there were people that had to, I found myself praying that President Obama would change his mind, that President Putin would change his mind. And we had, contrary to what you may hear or not, we had very little influence with either one of those two. And so, but as I was dealing with these immovable obstacles, just asking, Lord, what do I do? And this is a weakness. We have no influence here, and yet I believe this is something you would want us to do. You're through prayer, the word, and circumstances, and counsel of wise people. And so I just started keeping a little logbook, and I just called it Immovable Obstacles, and would ask the Lord to move these obstacles, and started with a list of 3 or 4, grew to 10 to 20, and would take the first 10 or 15 minutes of each day just asking him to move this. And of course, he does what he does, which is, as we pray about things every day, he then, in some cases, changed how I was praying about it, gave me verses to pray, highlighted fears that I didn't even know I had, and spoke into my fears through that. But I'm on my 3rd book now, but again, I started about 10 or 11 years ago. I wish I'd started in the first 10 years of my career of praying through specifically immovable obstacles, things I had I couldn't think of some slick scheme of how I was going to influence my way around it or into it. He blew it up, made it clear that wasn't going to happen. And again, it's through failures, 10 or 11 dry holes in a row. Going, this is hard, you know. And then just the realization that the Lord says, I know where it is. I know where the oil and gas is. I put it there. Now, I would say not all of those were yeses. Probably 2/3 of them were yeses, where he did move immovable obstacles. He did change people's opinion and decisions that we had no influence over. 1/3 of them or so were no's, where he said, this is how I'm going to work. We're going to move the plow around this, but we're going on to point B. We're still going from A to B, but we're going to go around this one, and you'll see why later. And inevitably, he showed me there was always an answer. It was a yes or no, or go this way. And but I had absolute trust that if it's his deal, if it's his gig, his plan, his work, his business, he's got the answer. He's waiting for me, as Cedric said, humble myself and ask, help. And then help me know how to pray. And every morning, after 2 or 3 weeks of praying, the prayers would shift and change a little bit. But again, they were miracles. There's no, we can't point to science or technology or money or resources or anything. It was his deal, and he got the glory.
You and I had a conversation, and I'm going to take you back 10, 15 years. We were talking about some of the challenges that you were struggling with on a very high level. And one of the things you shared with me was that you had established prayer groups all around the world, so that when you would fly into an area and you knew you were going to be coming into a difficult situation, you already had people on the ground who were, there was kind of an advanced prayer team, if you will, and when you came in, this was the first thing you did when you landed. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what my takeaway was. Prayer was that important that around the world there were people that when you would fly into an area, they were already praying about the situation that was happening. Was that correct?
Yeah, they knew I had no choice. They knew how. If that's our best weapon, we're in trouble. So they were praying, and the Lord raised up people that were very encouraging and would pray, and would say, "Hey, you're coming in. You want to grab breakfast, and we'll pray for you." And that was God's grace, His absolute encouragement.
Great. Cedric, prayer and the impact of prayer on your leadership.
Yeah, as I think about all, God, what He's done for us, it is amazing grace. All of these amazing things, of course, our eternal hope and blessed assurance. But prayer is just another one of those things. It's a gift to be able to talk to the living God, and that He listens and that He answers. Mostly in a loving yes way, but in the way that's best for us. And so I think back, to that, passage in John 15 where we're apart from me, you can do nothing. So we need to kind of get on board with that and live our best life because it's a part of abiding in Him. And talks about, praying without ceasing and you have not because you ask not. Lots of good kind of motives, if you will, to pray. And so for me, again, coming to Christ at an early age, I've kind of always had quick prayers, as I walk down the hall or as I, and then as you hit, difficulties, and you'll have them. That's a promise, by the way, also in John 16, one of my favorite verses, when Christ said that after a long kind of 2-chapter message to His disciples before parting, He said that I say all this so that in me you'll have peace. Perhaps our greatest need or greatest blessing, but that peace that comes from Him and no other. And then He said, but you will have trouble in this world. It's a guarantee, it's a promise. Second promise is even better. Don't worry, I've overcome the world. And so that opportunity to pray and to benefit from that and to experience that peace, I've experienced it countless times. I'm ashamed of my prayers. If you were to add them all up, it's 99.9% about me, and shamefully. And I really think I know that I would be much better off if I would spend a lot more of my prayer time focused on other needs. I've had the blessing of a lot of people in my life, whether it's people in other countries or fellowship groups or people that God has put in our life that pray for me, and I try to pray for them, and that's something we can all encourage each other and do better and do more of. There are times when it's easy to pray because trouble comes your way. It's, that first promise. I remember a little over a decade ago, I was in a job. I get in trouble a lot, but I got in so much trouble that I got fired. And that was not a hard day to know God's will for my life. God's will was for me to go home. I had security escort me out. Didn't think that was necessary, but so I left that day, and it was a public job. It was a CFO job for a public company, and so they put a press release out within the hour that I had left to pursue other interests. And so that was an easy day to pray, but maybe that's the harder time to pray is when things are going well, but you need to realize and have the perspective that you may think they're going well, but you're a moment away from trouble, and in the real sense, you're actually ever more dependent on God to keep you from temptation and stumbling and things that go with the easy days more than the hard days.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate that. Tom, prayer, how has it impacted you?
Yeah, I'll share a story from my life. I spent the first 22 years of my career with Arthur Anderson, and the way we describe Arthur Anderson, the way I describe it, we had 92 years of uninterrupted growth. The 93rd year was a bit problematic. And and what you learn through that the firm went from 12 billion in revenue to zero in about 6 months. And you learn the most important things when you're in a professional services, but it probably applies to almost every type of business, is the relationships you have with your customers and the relationships you have with your people is where all the value is. So you can recreate, and if conventional wisdom's wrong and you've got a different idea that's right, you can actually create a lot more opportunity through some of the trials. As it relates to prayer, in that, that was a time in my life where, difficult time where I had people praying for me, for our firm. I was praying for wisdom as a leader going through a crisis. And there's nothing like a great crisis to see the true, I'll call it character of people in organizations. There's people that will optimize on themselves, and there'll be people that optimize on the people. And if you're ever going to start a new business, that's a great interviewing technique, is have a crisis and see who's good and who's bad, and then just take the good ones. And but what happens with prayer is not only to discern God's will and ask for for His wisdom, but it also puts time delay between trouble and your reaction to trouble. And unless it's life-threatening and somebody's about to shoot you, time delay is a great thing to pray, to consider options, to slow down the pace of the action. And you'll end up making decisions that are more in line with God's will, as well as just better decisions. And it'll make you a better leader if you can put that time delay between, the world's on fire to what do I have to do. And prayer is a great way to do that, not only seeking wisdom from the Lord and guidance, but also to slow down the pace of decision making.
Great. Thank you. Well, I have about 37 additional questions, but I'm going to land on a final one here. We're going to wrap this up. So this is, and maybe a difficult question. So I'm going to frame it this way. The world today is very different from the world when we all started in some type of, in our careers. The world today is not necessarily a place that looks favorably upon living out your faith in the workplace. How did you do that? How did you live out your faith in the workplace? There are places where you don't have that opportunity, or it's not favorable for you to do that, or you actually can't. How did you because obviously faith, prayer, all of that is a significant part of what you've done, especially as you've talked about, I've been called to do this work. So how did you actually live out your faith in the workplace? Tom?
It's a part of being, I think, being a great leader. And people will see how, when you're the leader, everybody watches, everybody reads more into what you say than, there's the joke about the big important executive like Cedric looks out the window and says, the parking lot's full. And all the underlings say, I guess we need to do a cost reduction. And they start, and all he meant was the parking lot's full. And so you watch closely, how you and you get opportunities daily to demonstrate your faith and your priorities. How do you handle somebody that has a alcohol issue and there's a sexual abuse issue? You're on stage for that. How do you handle a high performing person with one of our core values is fun. I'm going to use a word that may offend some of you. So we have 5 core values. One of them is fun. Love what you do. Love who you do it with. No assholes. And how do you deal with a high performing person that fits in that category? And if you're low performing and you fit in that category, you're benign. Nobody even knows you exist. In a professional services firm, you can fade away and nothing happens. If you're high performing and bad culturally, the way I describe it in front of people is you need to be hunted down like a dog and killed. Because if you don't deal with the high performing, low value person immediately, especially the younger people with their texts, Tom isn't really committed to the values, and it destroys everything you've been working on. So you get opportunities to demonstrate your faith hourly in our business, because your faith, everything you're dealing with at our level is a problem. If it wasn't a problem, you wouldn't be dealing with it, and the crowd watches and they communicate how you dealt with that. So, if you want a great leadership book, pick the Bible. And just live by that. And I'm not as sensitive to what I say in the workplace. I've got to be authentic, and I've got to treat people fairly. And where we've stated that we're going to do things with related to our values, that we do them, we stick by them, and it's like breathing.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered the question.
No. Yeah. Basically, what I heard you say is, you live your faith out moment by moment, day by day.
And like these guys, because these guys are higher on the food chain than I am. I mean, that's all they deal with is stuff that people watch. The higher up you are, the bigger the organization, the more complex, the more time you spend on its resource allocation issues. Yeah, you can have this, you can't have that. It's personnel issues. You get promoted, you get demoted. You go out, you go. And it's all the issues come up to the table. That's how you handle them. And that's when prayer and time delay before action is a really great thing.
Thank you. Cedric.
I was kind of hoping the question would be, how haven't you lived out your faith? Because I've got a lot more examples of that. I don't claim victory, of course, but it's a moment-by-moment thing, opportunity to abide in our Lord and to daily take up our cross and follow Him. And He will show you what you need to do when you need to do it, give you the words when you need them, and so on. He empowers us, but He doesn't always give you everything in advance. He wants you to depend on Him. And so, everybody's job, whether it's leadership, whatever, every person matters to God. Every job matters. And so I think it's really just a daily or a moment-by-moment calling to just humbly walk with our God, and then He will, He'll do the rest. One example that came to mind was a while back. For some reason, the Lord has called me into these big companies. I actually didn't think it would be that way, and I started out wishing I could be in a small company, and I kept trying to get out of the corporate office. This goes back 20 years, and I just kept being pulled to the corporate office, and I was like, golly, you don't actually do any work here. You just spend money, and you just kind of watch everyone else work from afar, and it's humiliating in a way, because it's true. And so, but I was in the corporate office of a big company, and I had my boss come to me, and he pulled me aside, and he's a Christian man, or he professed Christ, and he said, "Hey, Cedric, look, I know you're, you godly person, and but you need to cool it in the office. You need to just kind of tone it down. We're a public company and HR, this and that." And I said, "Not much. I didn't. I said, thank you for telling me." But at that time, I actually felt pretty good that day. I thought, somebody knew I was a Christian because I said something or did something. Because most of the time, you don't necessarily know or see from our actions. But Mark, I shared with you a verse that's always been big for me. For years, like I said, when I went to college, I thought I wanted to go to seminary, and then I realized I'm not called to preach. I'm not. I've got a mouth, but I just am not gifted. I'm more a math type person. But the Lord showed me a verse. It's Matthew 10:32, when Christ said, "If you confess me before men, I'll confess you before the Father." And I don't think he was just picking people that are good at language. I think he's picking all of us with that. And for me, it's always hit me as just one example. There are lots of others in how you can integrate your faith in your life or faith in your work. But that's one example where you can be a yes person to our Lord and say, "I will confess you before men every chance I get." So I don't want to preach, and I don't like getting on stages, and but you called, and I thought of that verse, and I was like, golly, why'd you call me? I have to say yes. But lots of ways to integrate faith in life, and of course at work.
So you practiced humility, you stepped out in courage, you stood on stage, and you actually have given...
Showed up.
Yeah.
I confess Christ. I love him. I'm a follower.
Thank you, Cedric.
Yeah, so I had an assistant that shared a verse with me that kind of really spoke to me, and it's the verse that says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." There's two pieces of that. The first is, may see your good works. So it's kind of back to what Tom was saying. If you look at a sporting event, they don't interview the person that had the most penalties during the game. And in a work environment, people need to see that you're contributing to the business. It's not their business, it's God's business. So are you the last one in and the first one out? Pick one of those. But it's kind of, are you leaving it all out on the field while you're there? And then secondly, from the perspective of a publicly traded company, I would encourage you to, and this is where the Lord spoke directly to me. He said, "Mark, stop going out of your way to put a bushel over the light." And then there's almost this mental picture of the world, and it was all black, and there were little dots of light, and there were dots of light in valleys, and I'm convinced God is putting believers into the workforce as never before to reach people who have to go to work, who have to be around you. They don't have to go to church, but they have to show up every day and be around you. And he's putting people in these situations where they have to be around you and your light. And one of the first things around stop going out of my way to put a bushel over the light was, if I was, people have this view of, if you work for a public corporation, there's a separation of church and state. There's nothing to do with a public corporation. You can talk about football, you can talk about knitting, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about at lunch, and you can talk about the Bible, you can talk about Hinduism, you can talk about atheism, you can talk about your belief in the, Zoroastrian gods. And so Christians, I think, tend to come in thinking, oh, we better be careful. And I would just encourage you to look at your company's policies. Every public corporation has policies, ethics policy. One of them, in our case, the policy that applied as I looked at those was, what's the harassment policy? And as you can't go around and buttonhole people and pressure them while they're working and distract them from getting the job done. So again, going back to the sports analogy, it's not the people that are sharing the 4 laws in between plays. It's the people that are leaving it all out on the field. And so one practical thing he gave me early on in the first 10 years or so was, during lunch I was in BSF, Bible Study Fellowship, and I would do my lesson over lunch. And he said, why do you go out of your way to hide that Bible when you're done with your lesson? Why don't you just leave it on your desk? Why don't you just leave it open? And I found myself actually looking at it from time to time. It wasn't there as an ornament or a decorative deal, but I was actually referring to it when I started getting stressed out about things. There would be verses there that would speak into my life. So around year 8 to 10, I started just leaving a Bible out on my desk. And not for show, but stop going out of my way to get the smallest one I can get that can hide, that nobody can tell I've got. Just be you. Just be you, and just open that word up and have it open. And then, as you all know, in any work environment, people are always complaining. And typically it's, there's always something to complain about, even if it's a benefit. Well, it wasn't quite enough, or it wasn't, really what I was looking for. And as you know, about an inch below the surface, once you say, how was your weekend? It was great. There are some deep, deep issues people are struggling with. Kids, suicides, deaths in the family, cancer, heart issues that are just below the surface. And if you start your day by saying, Father, make me aware of who you want. Being God's person in the workplace is being available. I've heard this, and I really think it's being available to do what God wants you to do when he wants you to do it. Again, it's his work, his timing. And so, Father, make me available to who you bring across my path, and have the courage, after a while, when people are complaining about something, or my kid, just killed the cat, and, whatever, the police are after him, just having the courage to say, hey, you mind if I put that on my prayer list? Or put it in your own words, but then mean it, and actually pray about that. You find yourself starting to develop a care and a genuine concern about the person, get involved in their personal life, and they get, this person isn't a fake. They're actually genuinely interested in me as a person. Why are they doing that? We're supposed to be competing against each other. And so, begin praying about these people. Keep the Bible open. Begin praying about these people you interact with that have issues and struggles, and follow up. Ask them, how's it going with Joe or Mary or Sue? You don't have to keep telling them I'm praying for you. Just show genuine concern. And then the word gets out that so-and-so, that typically is religious. I hate that word, but so-and-so is religious. Well, that's okay, whatever you want to call it. But let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who's in heaven. So stop going out of your way to put a bushel of the lampstand. Have that word open and be available during the day. And the biggest challenge is, when Cedric said, I share many more failures here than successes, where during the day I get distracted with, I got this issue, I got this problem, my hair's on fire, this country's, doing this or that or the other. And before long I go through the days, 6 hours in the day, and I haven't even thought about anybody other than my little to-do list and my little stuff. But just asking God to make you aware. If it's got to be a train coming down the track, make me aware of those moments where you want me to step up and be available to show that I genuinely care, and say, hey, you mind if I pray about that? I've never had anybody say, no, please don't pray for me. I've had people look at me like, whatever works for you. And even, as Mark said, in certain countries it's unlawful to share your faith, in Muslim countries. But even there, just getting into conversations with ministers, tell me about, what does Islam say about this? What is this? And, let me tell you what it says. And would share, and then before long there's a natural link, or kind of say, well, in my faith it's, yes, it's against the law to proselytize, but if you're in get in a conversation with people, show interest in their faith before you start telling them, about yours and what's screwed up about theirs.
Thanks. Yeah. Our panel, can we give them thanks?